Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
So I'm genuinely delighted. It's a cliche thing to say, but I really am glad to be here. I've had very enjoyable conversations with many of you throughout this day, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A time. I really want to take what Drayson said to heart and have it be a time where we can honestly interact, whether we agree or disagree, but to continue in the spirit of Veritas and challenge one another to be thoughtful and to be reflective. And if there's nothing else that you get out of what I say tonight, I hope it'll be at least that. So, are we more than our genes? That's the topic for today's talk. At the heart of this question is a search for identity. And that's a pursuit that I believe resonates with most, if not all of us. So who am I? Well, I'm a scientist. I'm a Christian with a Hindu background, Indian ancestry, Canadian birth, and American citizenship. So that's a lot to unpack. So given today's topic, I'd like to start with who I am as a scientist. And you heard a little bit about this from Mark, and so I apologize for the repeat. I trained in computer science as an undergraduate at Cornell University, and toward the latter part of my years at Cornell, I performed research in a computational neurobiology lab, where I performed mathematical modeling of olfaction, or our sense of smell. And what you may not realize is that you and I can actually distinguish among thousands of different types of smells. And we accomplish this with a very intricate information processing network in our olfactory system. And so this field was very rewarding for me as an undergraduate because it allowed me to see the value of interdisciplinary study, applying my mathematical and computational skills to try to make sense of biological phenomena. But I felt limited or restricted in some way because of the lack of empirical data and the difficulty in generating enough of the appropriate kind of data to develop and test mathematical models that were fairly sophisticated. And it was around this time that the field of genomics was exploding onto the scene with the advent of the Human Genome Project. And so this was an international endeavor to determine the entire sequence of the human DNA. The project was actually completed well in advance of the projected date, and this was due in large part to remarkable advances in technology and biocomputing. And so it was becoming clear to me at that time that the Human Genome Project was ushering in a new era in science where the bottleneck was not the availability of data, but rather the computational challenges associated with making sense of the massive influx of new data, and new genomic data in particular. So, motivated by this challenge, I enrolled in a PhD program in genomics and computational biology at the University of Pennsylvania. And in following my PhD work, I joined the lab of Dr. Francis Collins at the National Institutes of Health, where I studied genomics in the context of human disease. And specifically, the question I asked was, what are the signals in our genome that tell us whether we might be at risk for diabetes or Alzheimer's? And moreover, when we find those signals, can we say anything about why they're causing disease? And that will directly lead to therapeutic benefits. Having finished my stint at the NIH, I joined the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill as a professor in the Department of Genetics, where I am today, and I continue to study the role of genomics in human disease. My responsibilities at UNC are diverse, but one of the most exciting things that I get to do is to cast a scientific vision and then lead a research team to execute that vision. Recently, large international teams have collaborated to identify thousands of specific DNA mutations or variants that are associated with a variety of different complex diseases, ranging from prostate cancer to heart disease to diabetes to schizophrenia. And one of the most significant discoveries in genomics in the last 10 years is that the vast majority of disease-associated DNA variants occur in regions of the genome that were once labeled junk DNA because they don't encode for genes. But what we now know is that they're not junk at all, but they contain functional elements that control where, when, and to what extent genes are going to be turned on. In other words, they serve as switches or dials that control gene activation. And you may have even heard on the news that someone with a particular disease had a defective gene or a mutated gene. But what we now know is that the vast majority of complex disease-associated DNA variants aren't altering the gene itself, but rather these regulatory switches or dials that are littered all across our genome, and even just 10 years ago we thought was junk. Very humbling, by the way, to realize that 95% of the genome that we were calling junk turns out to be some of the most important for the diseases in the human population. My lab at UNC is interested in finding out where these regulatory switches are and figuring out which ones are important in what disease contexts. And so to accomplish this, we've taken advantage of advances in progress in a field called epigenomics. Epi, that prefix epi is Greek, and it means above or beyond. And so epigenomics refers to a set of mechanisms that is above or beyond or distinct and separate from the DNA itself, but that can still control gene activation. So how does this happen? Well, DNA is in each of the cells of our body is very, very tightly packaged. And the cell is able to make marks on the packaging material. And those different combinations of those marks seem to indicate different kinds of functions for the underlying DNA sequence. And so, for example, if in a particular region of the packaging material you found the marks A, B, and C, it might mean that the underlying DNA sequence could function as a regulatory switch, for example. The fascinating thing about this is that environmental variables like diet or smoking or exercise, they can change these marks throughout your life and thereby change the function of your genome without touching your DNA sequence at all. So what this says is that your genetics doesn't completely determine who you are. The environment around you shapes the packaging material of your DNA and directs how your DNA is going to work. So that already tells us that we are indeed more than our genes. So maybe the question we really need to ask is, are we more than our biology? Are we more than the material, the genes or otherwise, that make up our bodies? And as a biologist myself, I've learned 3 major lessons that I'd like to share with you tonight that I think provide a framework for exploring this question further. First, biological science is very rarely about proof. It is much more about accumulating evidence toward a reasonable or likely explanation. In theoretical mathematics, one deals with derivations and hard rules and proofs. In contrast, in a science like genetics, one is usually dealing with diverse kinds of data and making all sorts of inferences. Now, don't get me wrong, there's certainly a logic that guides your inferences, but it's often more imprecise than people realize. Think of what a detective does, because science is actually a lot more like detective work. He or she is faced with a crime and essentially has to reconstruct the course of events that led to the crime. Obviously, there are often many possibilities, and so the job of the detective is to gather information and make a case for the most likely scenario. Oftentimes, the case that's made is so strong it feels like a proof, but it's really not. It's a likely and compelling scenario. It's the same way in biology or genetics. As a scientist, I'm faced with some particular unexplained biological phenomenon, and I'm tasked with uncovering the hidden mechanisms that explain it. And this is a lot more like messy detective work than it is like proving theories. And that brings me to the second point that I'd like to share. And that is that biological science is constantly self-correcting, It never closes the door on a possibility, even if it defies present assumptions. And one of the best examples of this is junk DNA. In the beginning of the genome era, most scientists assumed that the parts of the genome that don't code for genes are not functional. Over time, many of those same scientists have produced the most compelling evidence to show that that's indeed very wrong. And so what I'm saying here is that no matter how tightly held the view of junk DNA was, there was a sliver of openness in the scientific community to the possibility that it wasn't junk. And it was this openness that ultimately led to the dismantling of the misconception and scientific advancement. I mean, it's for this reason that universal negatives are very rarely issued in biology. Even the vocal atheist Richard Dawkins accepted that as a scientist, he must concede that there could be something incredibly grand and incomprehensible and beyond our present understanding. I don't want to misrepresent Richard. He doesn't believe that that's the case, but my point here is that as a scientist, he must concede that possibility for the reasons that I just mentioned. Finally, the third lesson is that some questions that have arisen from the work of genetics cannot be addressed by the tools in genetics or in biology. You know, at some point during the study of genetics, the question will arise, why did life forms originate in the first place? We can speculate, and it's a natural question to ask, but it is not one that science is equipped to answer. It's a lot like the following question, what is the color of 4? I think you'll agree with me that it's a grammatically correct sentence. We can certainly ask it if we please, but it doesn't make a lot of sense because color is not a meaningful construct to describe numbers. And so, while work in science might naturally lead us to ask such questions, it's evident that science does not always have the tools in the kit to provide an answer. This doesn't itself mean that there is an answer somewhere else, but it just means that we have to be faithful to what science is, and we can't extend the purview of science beyond what it is capable of addressing. So how do these 3 lessons inform our pursuit of the answer to this fundamental question, are we more than our biology? I believe that they liberate us from the shackles of the commonly held and often propagated view that science categorically disproves the supernatural, or even that science demands that it be treated as the sole arbiter of truth. In fact, science is necessarily agnostic with respect to anything outside of the natural realm. It doesn't support it, but neither can it refute it. Therefore, the important point here is that science does not constrain us to look only to science in our search for identity. So, what else might define who I am? Well, maybe my name is a good starting point. My name, Praveen Sethupathy, said properly is Praveen Sethupathy, is of Sanskrit origin. Praveen means skillful, Sethupathy means Lord of the Bridge. The bridge actually refers to a former chain of limestone shoals that connected the southern tip of India to the northern coast of Sri Lanka. And according to the ancient Hindu epic, the Ramayana, the bridge was constructed by Lord Rama and his army. So needless to say, my name is steeped in ancient Indian tradition and Hindu lore. And my Indian heritage is a part of who I am, and I was raised as a Hindu for 18 years. I appreciated Hinduism as a rich culture to enjoy, but it wasn't until my college years that I realized I didn't really know much about Hinduism as a belief system to live by. I had gone through the motions of various aspects of Hinduism and was familiar with many of the traditions and the stories of the faith, but I realized that I had no idea what it actually was or what it meant to me. I hadn't really stopped to think about it. So I decided to embark on a fairly ambitious endeavor to read many of the Hindu scriptures. And over time, as I learned more about Hinduism, I became curious about how it compared to the host of other religions out there. And eventually I ended up studying some of the major texts from religions such as Buddhism and Islam and Christianity. What was it that stood out for me in Christianity? It was meeting the person of Jesus. You know, he's the supposed hero of the story, and yet he appears as a naked, disfigured, and pathetic man dying on a cross. It wasn't the superhero Krishna from Hinduism that I was used to reading about. It wasn't even the valiant warrior Muhammad from Islam. But one of the first things that I would learn is that in the cross, Jesus was turning upside down my notions of power. He wasn't on the cross because he was powerless to stop it. He was on the cross because that's how far he'd go to exercise his power to save. And you and I often exercise power by imposing our authority or our perceived superiority on the world. He chose to exercise his power by laying down his life before the world. You and I often think of power as being driven by force or some element of force, whereas Jesus' power seemed to be driven by love. I mean, I had never seen or read anything like this. I mean, it didn't make me a Christian immediately, but it intrigued me, and it did make me want to deepen my knowledge of this person. I became involved in evaluating the historicity of Christ and the various claims of the Gospels. And I did this actually much in the same way that I carry out scientific work: gather data, make inferences, and make the case for the most compelling scenario. Why was this so important for me to do? You see, stripped of Christ, Christianity was no more, no less compelling to me than any other faith tradition. It is the person of Jesus that makes all the difference to me. And having become convinced eventually of not only his historicity, but also that he was who he said he was, it's worth asking the question, what is it that he had to say about the question, are we more than our biology? And Jesus clearly validated the importance of truth acquired by reason, but he also established the vital importance of truth acquired by revelation. And what he reveals is that we are indeed more than our biology. We have a spiritual nature that is not entirely captured by the material of our body. I want to be clear, this is a belief. It is not testable or set forth by science. And as such, I understand it can be unnerving. But it is a truth that is established in my life as part of a relationship. It's a lot like the love I have for my wife. You know, my love for her is not scientifically provable per se, but it's certainly real, and she trusts it as real because of the experience and depth of our relationship over the last decade and a half. When I started following Jesus and finding my identity in him, it was a very confusing time for my family and friends. You know, was I rejecting my Indian culture? Would I change my name? Would I suddenly be John or Peter? The confusion was not unfounded because many before me in a similar position had done exactly that. But Christ did not come to change names or to move people from one culture to another. He came to renew hearts and minds and to bring life where there was death. So it was my joy to share with my family that I would remain Praveen Sethupathy, that Christ was laying a claim on my heart, not on my name. And I explained that becoming Christian had nothing to do with rejecting my Indian heritage or being called by a different name. Rather, it was about embracing God's interwoven presence in the history of mankind and Christ's love and sacrifice for us and our need for him. And he was brewing within me a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to others, and a passion for justice. And the Christian faith has been multicultural from the beginning. And today there may very well be more Christians in Asia and Africa than in Europe and North America. And my Hindu heritage is a part of who I am, and a part of who I believe God created me to be. And tonight maybe you feel the same way about your cultural background, be it Jewish, Muslim, or Buddhist or humanist or anything else. But remember that our cultural background and our core beliefs about who God is too often get confused as the same thing. While they may be related, they are truly distinct parts of our identity. So in your search for identity, I would challenge you tonight to really ask yourself the hard questions. Maybe you have a background in the Christian faith, maybe some other faith tradition, or no faith at all. But if, like me at your age, you haven't questioned what that means to you or how that has shaped you, now is a great time to reflect on that and to do your own detective work. Don't take my word for anything I've said here tonight. This is just a personal story. But don't be afraid to do that detective work. And there's nothing to lose, and certainly science doesn't stop you. But if there really is a God who created you, then there's everything to gain in that search for identity. Thank you very much.
Has to do with epigenetics, and no matter what epigenetic factors you're talking about, they're still acting on your genome. So how do you still get beyond the question of are we more than our genome? Because if I have the same epigenetic factors acting on me that you do, because my genome is different from yours, I may react completely different from you. I mean, it still comes down to our genome at the end of the day, right?
The genome and the epigenome are more related than the word epi lets on. And in fact, I just wrote a perspective article for a trio of papers that are going to be coming out in Science, or actually I think have come out as of this week, where they make that point in a more definitive way, that indeed your genetic complement can dictate the kind of epigenomic marks that are present on that packaging material. So there is a closer relationship between the genome and the epigenome than what has been thought in the past. That being said, I think the more critical point I was just trying to make is that there are other non-genetic factors that can control the epigenome that don't require any changes to the DNA sequence at all. And so what that...
It's still acting on the genome, correct?
It is still acting on the genome. It's not independent of the genome. So it's influencing genome function without actually altering the genome itself. That's correct.
I have a more personal question, but it's not uncomfortable, so. I was just wondering if you've encountered any conflicts between your faith and your scientific research, and what they've been and how you handle them.
That's a great question. I have personally, at the present stage, I don't feel any conflict. I find that scientific life and a faith-based worldview are particularly harmonious for me. But there have been, at different stages of my career, bigger problems that I've had to deal with. And so, for example, one pertains to evolution. This is a conversation that we're having nationally. Oftentimes we're not having this conversation in a very loving way, but we're having the conversation nonetheless. And that can be a very sticking point, and this is something that I have studied very closely and very intensely, and continue to do and anticipate that I will continue to do throughout the rest of my career and life. Because the study of evolution is fantastic and mysterious. Despite the ample scientific evidence for it, there's still a lot that we don't understand about it. And so there will be those kinds of questions that arise. I'll be very upfront. My position on this is as an evolutionary creationist, if you will, right? In that I find perfect harmony in appropriate interpretation of biblical material, as well as seeing God as having been able to use the mode of evolution as creation. And I understand that in different communities that is controversial. But I think the bigger point in my studies is that these kinds of questions that pit science against religion, by and large, are fallacious. I don't think the tension is real. And oftentimes the tension that is brought up is relatively recent in history. It's tied up with politics. It's very complicated and confusing. But if you go back to the early church, they had diverse opinions about how to interpret Genesis 1 and 2. And so there's a lot more to uncover here, and I think we can do that together within the Christian community and outside of the Christian community. But I don't think it's as, disharmonious as some would make us believe.
All right.
Please, go ahead.
So as evolutionary psychology increases in influence, and as our society continues to tackle the idea of philosophical materialism, could you see those two philosophical ideas causing a resurgence of the ideas of eugenics, the idea that sin or evil could be found within genetics?
So, that is a common concern that is brought up. But I just have never seen why it has to go in that direction. I cannot prevent someone from taking it in that direction if they choose to. But there's nothing inherent to that discussion that would, and to the process of biological evolution that would lead us there. I think that's what I struggle with is would you like to comment on that? Okay, yeah. I just don't see anything inherent to the study of evolution and how it influences our psychology, or a range of other phenotypes and behaviors has to lead to eugenics, right? I'm sensitive to the notion that it has in the past and can again in the future, but I find this to be akin to the questions of whether, the realization of molecular evolution and speciation leads to atheism. I think while many people who purport evolution are atheists, there's nothing inherent to the evolutionary process that demands that belief, right? And so I feel the same way about this. I'm not sure if that was helpful. Okay, maybe I can catch you afterward, sorry.
You mentioned that you looked into some of the historical proofs for Jesus. And I was wondering, could you just say what 2 or 3 of those are that you found compelling?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of scholarly work that's been done on, first of all, whether or not he even existed. There is a small community of scholars on that topic that maintain that the evidence isn't compelling. That is a very, 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 very small fraction. And the vast majority of those who are comfortable with Jesus as a historical character are not even Christian to begin with. And many of them come from the Jewish faith and a number of other faith traditions. And so that was the first thing that I dealt with was, this isn't really worth my time if there isn't good evidence for him even as a historical character. Because Scripture lays out that if he didn't exist, and if the resurrection didn't happen, then we are to be pitied among all men, is what it says, right? And so we ought to take that seriously. And so the historicity of Christ was one that I examined carefully. And really what a lot of that comes down to is extra biblical information about the happenings during Jesus' lifetime and recordings of various things that Jesus either said or did. That those extra biblical, some of them appear to be not quite as legitimate as others, but overwhelmingly, if you look at the body of evidence there, it appears to suggest that there is a vast array of extra biblical information dated to the time that the authors originally wrote it, like Josephus or Tacitus, that indicate the historicity of Christ. So that's one example. Another example is just to sort of, deal with this issue that often comes up about contradictions in the gospel accounts, for example, right? So I was very eager at a time where I had a bit more antipathy toward Christianity to try to embrace some of these contradictions and use that as a way to prevent myself from looking further and to shoot down Christians. But it was in that process that I was very uncompelled by the vast majority of quote-unquote contradictions. Are there differences? Yes. And I think it would be scarier if there weren't. because that would immediately make me think about some sort of a conspiracy or a desire to kind of paint the same picture so that everybody believes the same thing. So digging deeper into that, I became less and less compelled, actually, about the so-called evidence for contradictions. So that's another example of the kind of the study that I've been doing, and there are numerous other things as well.
Given the epigenomics greater susceptibility to environmental factors, if there was you don't see a lot of genetic predestination or whatever. Do you see any kind of correlation of epigenetic factors to population or cultural trends that would also sort of eclipse individuality?
What do you mean by, can you clarify what you mean by eclipse individuality?
So with the idea of saying that you're more than your genome, is there any way to say that, or not say, that all of these epigenetic factors, your grandfather had diabetes, or was subject to famine or something like that these kind of cultural trends where everyone's grandfather is subject to something in your community, and so once again you're more than your genome, but are you more than your epigenome as determined by cultural or population trends?
Right. So I mean, I suppose you could say that if you wanted to capture in the term epigenome all of the variables that could potentially influence the epigenome, right? Then I suppose we could say that we have a question on our hands, right, about whether we're really more than our epigenome. Because at that point, what we've done is just taken all of life and all of biology and wrapped it into the word epigenome, right? So, I think one of the difficulties in really answering that question more in depth, though, is that this whole field of epigenomics is really in its infancy. This trio of papers that just came out in Science that I mentioned, all it really demonstrated was that there's extensive variability in the epigenome profile across human individuals. That's the stage of the research that we're at right now. And so I think there's a lot more to do to better understand what are the different factors that are controlling that variability. And in answering one of the first questions, some of those factors do appear to be genetics itself, but not all of them. And so we're figuring out what are some of these other factors. We know about some prominent ones like diet and exercise and smoking and things like that. But what are the things that prominently influence our epigenome? Even that we don't thoroughly understand now. So I think there's a lot more to uncover before we can really talk about it meaningfully.
Yeah, I was wondering about kind of the realm where, the only really realm that I've ever kind of perceived conflict between science and religion is really in trying, and I mean, the risk of beating the proverbial dead horse. The problem of evil, I think, is really interesting. I guess not really within, I agree with you in the realm of genetics, with, cancer predisposition and things like that, but I think science kind of offers these very neat answers, or not, neat, but I think that then kind of when you place that in the larger context of religion, it becomes far more complicated. Like a flood is just a flood, and you can explain that scientifically, and then when you kind of extrapolate to a more religious context, and you try and understand why that would have happened, I mean, I guess I'm just interested to see kind of how you make sense, whether genetically or kind of in a larger scale sense, but I'm really interested in kind of the problem of evil as approached from science and also religion.
That's a wonderful question, and I'm going to disappoint you because I don't have a neat and concise answer. Yeah, but it's a fair question, and it's a very good question, and it's one I spend a lot of time thinking about. There are related questions that I think about a lot too. One that came up earlier today in conversation was there death, and evolution would suggest that there was death and suffering before the fall, and I subscribe to that. But some are challenged by that view because it seems to suggest, we have a view of who God is, and He's a loving God and all of that. And so would He really choose a mode of creation that involved so much, rabid killing and death and suffering? Right? It's a tough question. And the answer that I'm going to give to this is going to seem like a cop-out, and I understand that. But it's where I am right now, and I think it's where a lot of our thoughts are presently at the moment. And that is that the conflict comes because we are trying to overlay that information on some sort of a predetermined concept of who God is. And I think that therein lies the difficulty in what we're trying to do. I think that if you want to suppose that he exists, he's far more complicated than just sort of thinking of him as a warm and fuzzy loving God. There's a lot more going on that we get sort of intimations of, but don't understand the full picture of when you read Scripture. And so, you know, the more that I dwell on that, the more okay I actually am with this notion that maybe I don't fully understand how God's love is somehow consistent with his ability to use this kind of mode of creation. That doesn't mean I have an answer and I have a model that I can kind of neatly fit those two things together. And I want to piggyback off of that to just give a larger point here. One of the things I like about Veritas is it's not, you know, person X convincing person Y or vice versa. It's having a discussion and recognizing that many of the members of different belief systems in this room here today have questions to answer like this, that there are challenges to be posed to one another. And that's only going to sharpen our ability to you know, think more deeply about what it is that we say we believe or what it is that we think there's evidence for. So I want to validate the question, but unfortunately not sure of the answer.
Yeah, my question goes back to epigenetics.
And I remember back in the 90s when this first started coming out and everyone was really excited about it because it completely changed everything about how we thought about genetics. And especially this idea of junk DNA at that time. I know there was a lot of people in the atheist community who were like, kind of like, ha-ha, you know, the contents in that to them seemed to provide some compelling evidence towards evolution and therefore in their minds towards atheism. Given the study you've done over the last 15 years, how has epigenetics influenced the way you think about that issue? Or how has epigenetics, I guess, really given you a compelling reason to believe in God? Or how has it given you reasons to perhaps doubt at times?
I am not sure that epigenetics has given me any reason to believe in God necessarily. And I really don't think that that caused me to doubt either. I think what it has done is humbled me because, you know, this is such an important layer of gene regulation that we never considered as important as it actually is until quite recently. And there are all sorts of different kinds of discoveries like that in science that I think are extremely humbling as they point out how much we're just sort of scratching at the surface of knowledge. No matter how advanced and remarkable technology we have at our disposal. So, you know, while sort of indirectly study on epigenetics has made me think about God, directly I don't think that it has influenced the way that I think about God. Remember what I shared earlier, I myself subscribe to the predominance of genetic and genomic evidence for molecular evolution. But the key point that I want to make is that there is nothing inherent to that process that demands an atheistic worldview. Many people who hold to evolution have an atheistic worldview. I won't dispute that. But it's not demanded by the evolutionary process. And there are scores of people that hold to an evolutionary mode of creation and that have a faith-based perspective and that are Christians and that are also practices of other faiths. And so I think therein lies the more critical response that I'd like to give is that regardless of whether epigenetics contributes to the evidence for evolution or not, that to me is irrelevant with respect to whether or not God is the author of evolution. I think those are two distinct things.
Now, to your point about junk DNA revealing some sort of an evidence for evolution, there is actually something in that. And I'll try to be brief about this, but this is particularly fascinating kinds of genomic data that have become available to us just in the last 5-10 years. Right? So viruses can integrate into our genome, different kinds of viruses. Okay? And they can integrate into the genome of other species as well. Okay? And they've done this, and we can see where they're inserted. Now that we've sequenced our genomes, we can see where their viral integrations are. We can see spots that are not human DNA, but viral DNA. Okay? And we can make this happen in the lab now, so that this can happen is not a controversy. Okay? What we find is that there are viral integration events in human that are predominantly shared with the chimpanzee and with the rhesus monkey. And as you go throughout the tree, the extent of sharing of these retroviral integrations are less and less. There's another species of these kinds of viruses, it's called retrotransposons. One of the funny things these guys can do is a cut and paste mechanism. It can copy itself, paste itself somewhere else in our genome. And so we can see our genome actually littered with various duplicated copies of these retrotransposons, which are thought to have been derived from these viral integration events. And what's fascinating about that is that when they cut themselves out and try to paste themselves back in somewhere else, our bodies can actually truncate that transposon so that the next time it tries to do it, it can't do it because we've cut off a very critical part of that transposon that allows it to paste itself back in. So that's a mechanism we've come up with to be able to guard ourselves against what these are called jumping genes. And you can imagine if you've got stuff jumping around our genome, potentially disrupting all sorts of different kinds of genes and regulatory switches, that could be very bad. So this is a mechanism that we have to be able to protect ourselves against these jumping genes. What we see is that the locations in the chimpanzee genome where there are these evidences of truncated jumping genes are exactly the locations where we have truncated jumping genes. This is remarkable. If you calculate the probability of this occurring independently in human and independently in the chimpanzee, it's a number that we cannot even calculate. That's how small that probability is. And that's just talking about human and chimp. Forget about that number when we actually have data to incorporate into this analysis over 17 different mammalian species and other kinds of species as well. And so the most parsimonious hypothesis there is that this happened to a common ancestor, which has then been retained in the organisms that evolved from that common ancestor. Now, I don't want the conversation tonight to dwell solely on this, but I did want to answer that point in saying there are those kinds of things, and so at times when you've heard of people saying, look, this isn't junk DNA, there's actually information encoded here that may be telling us something about our past, those are some of the kinds of things that have come out since our ability to code the genome. But I do want to end again with the critical point. That to me, with the study and the work that I've done has no bearing on whether God is the author of the process or not. It's an observation. Again, as we said, it's not proof. But it's what we do in science. We gather data, we make inferences, and we make the case for the most likely and compelling scenario.
Hi there. That's loud. So, I had a question about the effects of sin on the genome as far as that goes. We see in Proverbs, it says that, a fool's life is going to end in destruction. A righteous person is going to live. There's always promises as to how someone lives and the effect of that life being, longer or maybe more fruitful. Do you reconcile that? I guess the question is, do you believe, or better, based on what you talked about belief, do you believe that sin has an effect on the genome And if you have any thoughts on that, I'd like to hear them.
Yeah, that's also a very interesting question. This is a fantastic crowd. But it's yet another one of these questions that is very difficult to answer because it's not the kind of thing you can gather data on, right? That's what makes it so difficult to be able to have any kind of an answer to that question. I can certainly provide you a sense of my belief or speculation about that. But just to make the point clear that this is entirely outside of the realm of anything that's testable, right? Could sin have an influence on our genome? Sure. I mean, I don't, you know, being a person who believes in God, there is nothing that I don't think can happen, or there's nothing that I don't think can happen, right? Theoretically, anything is possible. This also comes from my scientist mentality. I can't rule out that possibility. I don't have any way of testing it. I don't have any way of actually figuring out what the probability of that is, but I can't rule it out either. And there's nothing, either scientifically, and nothing in Scripture that would command me to rule that out. And so therefore, I must hold on to it as a possibility. But I'm not, it may be sort of an interesting, sort of stimulating question, but I think it falls into the category of so many other mysteries about how sin influences us that we don't understand. And maybe, you know, is there biological impact in addiction? Sure, right? And so if you want to translate sin into something a bit more palpable in your lifestyle, right, then yes, suddenly it becomes a lot more testable for us to say, certainly that can influence your epigenome, certainly that can influence your genome and thereby affect cellular function and disease. So it just depends on how you want to frame the question.
You kind of glossed over this in your introduction, but I'm curious what led you to believe in the Christian faith and reject the possibility of other possible faiths or even atheism. Like, what was so compelling to you?
Yeah, so this is, you know, it was really actually what I shared in the talk, and that is the person of Jesus. He was what was compelling to me. There was nothing about the morals of Christianity or the stories of Christianity that made them any more or less compelling to me. In fact, if you just look at you know, the golden rule or the variety of different sort of you know, guidelines to live by in the major religions, not very different. And so what was different to me in reading about it was the person of Jesus. The way that he was described in the gospel accounts was something that I had never encountered, right? I mean, I expected my God to be a superhero. That's what I would write up if I was going to write up a story, right? And so Krishna made sense to me. All while I was growing up, I resonated with him because he was a Superman to me, right? And yet here was a God that was being depicted in a completely and utterly different way. And so I think that was the hook for me. That's what made me dwell on what the worldview of Christianity was in relation to the others. Believe me, I would have done a lot to be able to walk away from that journey, that spiritual journey that I embarked on in college, and to be able to say, you know what, all religions are the same, and they all kind of point to the same thing, they're all just different sort of cultural manifestations. That's what I grew up believing. That's what I passionately wanted to believe. That's what would have made my life a lot easier. But I couldn't come to that conclusion because it was the person of Christ was something that I had to reckon with, and I couldn't walk away.
Thank you.
So, in one of Paul's writings, he writes that, like looking into a dimly lit mirror, we see some things in part and we understand some things in part. And also, John 14:26 says, "But the Advocate, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you all things and will remind you of everything I have said to you." In light of those scriptures, what dimly lit questions do you seek to answer in your research, besides some of the things you've already mentioned? And in what ways has your relationship with Christ illuminated those things and showed you understanding when you didn't find it in other ways, I guess you could say?
You know, that's interesting because I've often interpreted and applied those passages in my life with regard to things of a more direct spiritual nature. In other words, some of the mysteries of the faith that despite subscribing to the faith and publicly proclaiming my Christian faith, there are of course mysteries that I don't understand. Even the Trinity is something that I would not be able to really explain and model out in front of you and convince everybody about, right? And so those are some of the things that I've really thought about with regard to those verses. Being able to understand those things beyond what I am capable of now with my finite mind, right? I have not really applied those verses to the scientific questions that I ask in the lab, in part because while I believe God loves me and is interested in what I am doing, as I believe is true for everybody here, I think the scientific questions are not really his fundamental interest, right? For example, if it were, I think Genesis 1 would be a lot clearer, and we wouldn't really be having that conversation right now, right? So I just don't think that that's really what God's fundamentally interested in helping us understand, right? And so I think for that reason, not to say that he doesn't care about the work that I'm doing and in some mysterious ways and helping me and enabling me to think clearly and to do well, but you know, I haven't really applied those verses in that way to the scientific work that I'm doing. But you know, in some way though, I may be able to link it back to one of the answers that I provided to an earlier question, in that one of the things that, you know, one of the ways in which I am able to worship in the science that I do is in how regularly it humbles me. And I was speaking with a few folks earlier today in saying that 90% of the time when we develop these wonderful, great hypotheses that we think we're so smart for developing and test them, they're wrong. But it's not really that they're wrong, it's that they're incomplete. And so we go back and we figure out what did we miss, and we put that back into the model, and then we were a little bit more right, but we're still wrong. And what that tells me is, again, that we are just scratching at the surface of knowledge. It's extremely humbling, and I think that induces me to worship.
So in your talk, you talked a little bit about the human thirst for truth. And the prominent philosopher Albert Plantinga raised the question, and he said that if we did just evolve, then our cognitive faculties weren't concerned with truth, but they were concerned more with survival. And I was just wondering to see if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so some have tried to say that that's not true. Some have tried to, no pun on true, there it is. Some have tried to actually suggest that the evolutionary mechanism can explain our desire for our search for identity or our search for truth, right?
And yeah, I think it must be confessed that while those are interesting discussions to have, and as scientists we can't close our door to those discussions and we should engage them fervently, the evidence as it stands is minimal, in my opinion. That doesn't mean that more work cannot be done, right? And that more information cannot be produced. But I do think that that is one of the more interesting questions to grapple with in the scientific community. Because if we're not able to explain that well, it could suggest that it is our spiritual nature that is primarily concerned with that, right? And that it is our image of godness, if you will, that is what's primarily concerned with that, and not our material nature.
I am of the belief that it is actually going to be more intertwined, right? That it's not, I sort of argue against dualism in the sense that I don't like to sort of separate the body from this whatever other spiritual nature that we're talking about. So actually it's probably more complicated and there's some sort of intertwining, which is why probably so much of faith and religious life can be explained by some material things. I just don't think it can be wholly explained by material things.
Hello. First off, I'd like to thank you for publicly representing a middle ground between rationality and spirituality, which I don't think gets much airtime in this country. I think most people fall there, but you don't see them. They're not the talking heads on TV. But my question for you, personally, I am agnostic, and when I look at the world, the universe, I see how science explains it, and I see how there could be room for a God, or in the case of identity, I see how there could be room for a soul, yet I also see how I don't believe it would be necessary, because with my understanding, whether or not it exists, it would not change the truth. So I am content to believe in nothing in a way, yet I was not raised like that, I was not born like that. Instinctively, when I see something I don't understand, my first reaction is the supernatural, even if it's only for a brief second before my adopted rationality kicks in and I start to try to explain this. Like, I don't believe anyone is truly born agnostic. I think we're all born with more imagination than rationality. So my question for you is, do you think someone like me, someone with a soul kind of emphasis on rationality or the supernatural, am I rejecting a part of my humanity here?
Well, going back to one of the earlier comments that you made, I think it is interesting. We get caught up into this debate about whether something seems to be necessary, right? And I think it's a fairly natural way to frame the discussion, because that's often how we go about trying to prove things, right? We have a phenomenon. To say that, X contributes to it, we test the hypothesis that X is necessary, though often not sufficient, for that phenomenon, right? And so I get the logic behind that, right? But I guess what I'm arguing for is that, two things maybe. One is, just because we perceive something to be unnecessary, given the current data, does not imply that it is not real, right? So just because we usually go about doing science that way doesn't mean, and for example, we have a lot of evidences of this in science, right? Where, for example, there's a lot of redundancy encoded in our biological system. And so you can knock out a particular component and not change the phenotype at all. But it doesn't change the reality that that component is actually involved in that phenotype. It's just that there's redundancy encoded in the system that masks that necessariness, right? And so there may be something like that going on in your estimation of this as well. And so I think purely on the basis of that, it would be dangerous to reject it outright. But I respect, though, your agnosticism from the point of view of saying that that's where you are right now, right? And so I don't think it would be helpful to tell you whether you're rejecting your humanity or not, but I more would like to comment on this use of the necessary argument to determine whether something is actually happening or not. And I think maybe I would question that, and I have questioned that myself. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
I was wondering, so when you were kind of exploring different beliefs, you proved to yourself the historicity of Christ, and you're very intrigued by the person of Christ, but what kind of made you come to the conclusion that after he died, his heart literally started beating again? Because that's not necessarily the same.
Yeah. Well, I do want to, I'm sorry, were you done?
Yeah.
I'm interrupted. Okay. First of all, I just want to clarify, I would not say that I have proven the historicity of Christ. I think much in the way, I know what you meant, but I just do want to make that point clear again, that much in the way that we deal with our scientific claims, I'd like to stay away from the proof argument, because that's not a lot of what we do in science. But I think the case is compelling. And it was the compelling nature of that case that made me stick with it longer and want to evaluate some of the other claims of the Gospels, including the resurrection of Christ. And that is the Holy Grail. I mean, everything hinges on that, right? And as I mentioned earlier in the Pauline epistles, where it says, if the resurrection didn't happen, then we, meaning followers of Jesus, are to be pitied among all men. This whole thing is a shame. So everything hinges on that. And so I want to validate that question because it's very, very important to include that component in this sort of journey that I went on. But I did evaluate that, and that occurs in two ways, I would say. The first is along the lines of the other kinds of evaluations, looking at the various evidences out there, thinking about how likely it was that that text was written at the time that it was said to be written, or thinking about whether or not it could have been inserted later. Those are all the kinds of literary machinations and historical studies that one can do, various claims that people have made about that you could look into. That was one avenue that I took. The second avenue is in actually how that story is written is extremely compelling, and I missed it so many times until I had those initial feelings of maybe something's going on here. This whole Jesus person is very, very intriguing, and I want to look into it further. It wasn't until that happened for me that I was able to see other aspects of that literature that were compelling. For example, it is the women who first discover the empty tomb, right? This is a culture where women are not particularly glorified, okay? That's putting it mildly, okay? And here was a story where the disciples, the men, looked foolish. And the women were, in fact, heroes of the story, trying to rally the troops and say, no, look, really, something's going on, right? And so while that might seem like a minor point to us today, that was in some ways revolutionary for people reading it at that time. And, if Peter and John and these guys are responsible for fabricating this story, really doesn't make a lot of sense because they really look like idiots all the way through. So, if I'm going to make up a story, well, maybe they were smarter than me, but if I'm going to make up a story, I don't want to look like an idiot, right? But that's not what happens in the gospel accounts. And so, there's something that's very intriguing about that. There are a number of things like that. I mean, we could spend more and more time going over it. Just one of those things is not compelling enough. It's the accruing of those kinds of pieces of evidence, right? And then at some point, your faith kicks in. At some point in that process where you're saying, you know what, it's not turning out to be as easy to reject this. And then when you start to put the story of Christ and why he did what he did into the larger account, and then I sort of stepped back from the Gospels and ended up reading all of the Torah and the Judaic law and the writings of the prophets and all of the rest of the Old Testament, and began to put what Jesus said he had to do and wanted to do into the context of all of that, it started to come together for me, and I was able to piece it together and say, this is not quite as crazy as it first seemed. And while, a resurrection is completely not scientifically explainable, right? When you get to a certain point in that journey where you feel like that the possibility of God is not quite as small as you once thought, then the challenge in accepting that becomes less, right? And so it's just sort of this tug of war that happens where, it's not everything coming together neatly and nicely. It's the accrual of evidence, the understanding of how this is all fitting together, this softening your sort of perception that this is not quite as hokey as it seemed, and that kind of tracking together at some point fit together for me. That may not necessarily be everyone's experience as they track through this. And ultimately, I will have to appeal to a belief and to a faith, and to say, so much of the rest of this has come together in a way that I would not have predicted. And so I have a choice. I can say, well, forget all that, the resurrection still seems ridiculous. Or I can say, I don't know, maybe. And I think that's the direction that I took.
On the current issue of Fast Company magazine is depicted the CEO of a company called 23andMe. And she is described as the scariest CEO on the planet. And I believe it's because that her company, for a couple $100, will analyze anybody's DNA. And so next week they can find out their propensity for disease or all other kind of things. So can you elaborate on that, and is that scary to you?
Yes. It's exciting to me as a scientist. This is where we were all hoping to go. This was the hope and the promise of genomics, that it would transform the way that we did medicine. Personalized genomics, personalized medicine, these are all phrases that were born out of the Human Genome Project, with the idea being that you could go to your doctor, be screened for your DNA, and be told what your risk assessments for this disease or that. That is the Holy Grail. That's what we would love to do. What's happening now, there is a fear. As much as we are proponents of the underlying technologies and the science and things like that, there is a fear that it is premature. In the sense that we don't yet have a good grasp of how to relay this genetic information to patients. So someone publishes a paper in Nature saying they've done a large-scale genetic association study and found that this particular DNA variant is associated with diabetes, type 2 diabetes, right? If you drill deeper, really what they're saying is if you had 100 people with the disease and 100 people without the disease, 80 with the disease would have that variant and 60 without the disease would still have that variant. So it's not deterministic. It's not as though you have the variant, you have the disease, you don't have the variant, you don't have the disease. It's sort of dialing up or down, whether or not you have certain kinds of variants, your risk for eventually getting diabetes. So how do you communicate to a patient? Yes, we sequenced your genome, we found a variant that we think increases your risk for obesity by 1.5%. What exactly does that? I wouldn't know what to do with that information, right? Maybe I should exercise more, or maybe 1.5% doesn't mean anything. I mean, I don't know. You know, if I'm relatively healthy, maybe it's not a big deal, right? And so we don't yet have a good handle on how to relay some of this information and to protect patients from that information. And so there are a lot of studies that are being done now in the clinical genetics arena, and survey studies as well, to say, well, if we gave you this information, how would you respond, right? And it runs the gamut, with some people saying, I have no idea and I'd do nothing, right? And other people saying, I would freak out, right? And I would buy every single, approach out there to reduce my adiposity and do X, Y, and Z. And probably neither of those are particularly healthy, right? And so we have to get a better handle as geneticists, as our technology improves and as our ability to interpret the data improves, then we can think about more and more translating this information into the clinic. Great question. Please.
So as far as being more than our physical materials, what are your thoughts on like soul, spirit, ghosts, heaven, such like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially what I mean, is that when I say that fundamentally I believe that there is a spiritual nature to us that goes beyond the material of our body, what I'm suggesting there is that there's something like a spirit. I don't know exactly what that is. And I'm not sure that any of us really can say what that is. And there has been a lot of scholarly writing on it. And people even sort of quibble about, is the soul different from the spirit? I really don't know. But I think what I am arguing for is that there is something beyond our material nature. Exactly how that's represented, exactly how that's manifested, I don't think we will ever know. We are wired to be able to more fully understand our material nature because it's our material nature that is thinking about it, right? But the spiritual is harder to describe and harder to understand, and I think is going to be quite different than the material nature. So do I believe it exists? Yes. Do I understand what it is and what it means? No. Right? It's much like in science where we know there's some X factor that's contributing to something. All our data point to it. We have no clue what it is and what it even looks like and if it's even a gene. right? And so we find ourselves in those kinds of situations all the time. And I feel as though that's the situation we're in now with regard to the spirit.
Regarding your regarding genetics, is it you mentioned marks on packaging? Do certain activities code for certain marks? Say smoking a cigarette code for a certain mark on your I forgot the type of genetics exactly. And then so then could you match up certain activities with certain markings? And then if you can do this, I'm also wondering if the field has progressed enough to where you're doing this with the animal kingdom, as some consider as part of that. And then also, have you extended at all into the plant kingdom?
Yeah. So the answer to, I think, all of your questions, if I remember all of them, is yes, yes, and yes. So this has been extensively studied in plants, in yeast, in bacteria, in all sorts of different kinds of animal species, certainly in humans. So the notion of epigenetics and the field of epigenetics is not new. It's just our ability to be able to profile epigenetic marks in an unbiased genome-wide way. That's what's new. It's more of that technology. But the idea that epigenetic marks control gene activation without changing the DNA sequence is actually not a new thing per se, and has been known for quite some time in the studies of a vast array of different kinds of organisms, multicellular and otherwise. The first question that, I'm not sure I fully understood the first question. You were saying, are there marks that are associated with certain kinds of activities?
Yeah, so in my mind, this is what I'm thinking.
Yep.
If I were to smoke a cigarette,
yep.
That will produce certain chemicals within my body. I'm guessing most of this is going to be chemical activation. And that might create a certain mark that you could tell that I possibly smoked a cigarette. I mean, you could even do that with hair. But then, say I were to do something else, like perhaps if I were to lie, that also produces chemicals with my body. And I'm wondering if that would also produce those marks.
Yeah, so that goes back to one of those earlier questions. I forget who it was that asked it, but in my response I was talking about, well, it depends on, I think it was the question about sin and the epigenome, right? But, if you want to encapsulate sin in some sort of, behavior or activity, then you can translate that into a scientific question per se, right? By saying, does this activity that you can measure and quantitate, does it associate or induce certain kinds of epigenetic marks? As you might imagine, that kind of thing is easier to do in animals. Not lying, per se, but other kinds of behaviors. You can get animals to do them in a controlled way. Controlled meaning you're controlling for a lot of other variables. And you're saying the only distinction between these two groups of mice, let's say, is how fast they're running on the wheel, right? Or some other kind of behavior that we care maybe a little bit more about. And then evaluate those mice epigenomically and see whether or not there are marks that track with the group that was doing a certain kind of a behavior as opposed to the control group. Those are the kinds of studies that are being done now. And they're much easier done in animals because, first of all, you can't take a bunch of humans and manipulate them in some sort of controlled experimental fashion, right? So the best you can do is to get samples from humans who smoke and get samples from humans that don't smoke and look to see whether there are marks that associate in one group compared to the other. Those kinds of things are now going to be done as well, but you can imagine that's a bit harder because how do you control for other variables? Maybe those folks that smoked also did something else that we didn't really measure. And so it's going to be harder in those kinds of studies to pinpoint it to the smoking, but certainly we can do our best in filtering out those kinds of variables and seeing whether or not we can detect these kinds of patterns. But doing those studies in animals will give us a greater confidence that we're likely to see something, and I'm sure that we will.
So, thank you first of all for coming out and sharing with us. We appreciate it. My question is on probably a little more personal level, if you don't mind, but I was curious. about how your encounter with Jesus affected and changed the way that you view yourself, others, and God himself?
Yeah. Well, it dramatically altered, almost instantaneously altered. And you can ask my wife about that for additional evidence, how I related to myself. I was explaining to some folks that I was doing dinner with that before Christ, I wrapped my self-worth very much in my ability to succeed. So I had to get 4.0s, I had to go to an Ivy League school, I had to win my swim meets, I had to win my tennis matches, right? And if I didn't, it was crippling to me, right? And I understand this doesn't describe everyone's situation, but this was who I was. In meeting Christ, what you recognize, and I sort of alluded to this, is that my identity is wrapped up in him. My self-worth is wrapped up in him, and not in my success. And that doesn't mean that I don't pursue excellence. It just actually means that I pursue excellence with joy, because I'm not so afraid of failing anymore. And I was afraid of failing, because if succeeding gives you worth, what use is failing, right? But if those are all just ends to, means to an end, right? If those are not the end itself, right? If your identity is wrapped up in Christ, which is what was happening to me as I was transitioning to being a Christian, right? That completely changed my perspective of myself, my motivations for why I was doing what I was doing. It didn't alter the end result of continuing to do well in my work and proceeding in my career, but my underlying motivations and and the heart behind them were completely altered. Right? I had many colleagues. Many of you may be aware that funding is tight. It's a very difficult time to be doing science and asking the government to fund it. And so a lot of people are very stressed out, right? And I have a lot of colleagues who, most of them actually, who I can resonate with because it's the way that I thought. And I really understand how they're feeling because their self-worth is wrapped up in whether or not they're able to get those grants and whether or not they're able to proceed. Otherwise, they're a failure, and why did they waste all this time even existing? Right? Those are the kinds of questions you sometimes hear people asking in this field. And so that's sort of a manifestation of the transformation in my life, in that for me, I'm going to give this the 120% that it deserves. But if it doesn't pan out, if it doesn't work out, I'm eager to see what God has for me next. I'm not sort of, I'm not done for.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
I'm in a class here right now called Evolutionary Biology that looks at a lot of mechanisms and change in animals. And one thing that we keep going over, whether it's selection on alleles or selection for a certain genotype like homozygotes or heterozygotes, one of the things that keeps coming up is that a lot of times selection on a certain trait can take a long time, and beneficial, like new mutations, are very rare, few and far between, and that selection on those beneficial mutations is possibly even rarer. And considering that the rate of molecular evolution can take a long time, would it make sense for, in your mind, how someone could piece together, or still believe in molecular evolution, but also be a believer in creation, which in a way might kind of imply that the Earth is younger than you might think by macroevolution. So in a more concise form, do you think it makes sense for someone to be a creationist and still be able to believe in molecular change and evolution?
Well, I hope so, because you're describing me. So, and I hope it's possible. I think it is indeed possible. And so I think what I would challenge you about in that question is the notion that Genesis demands a young earth. I respect my brethren who hold that view. and I have no, I have no sort of antipathy toward that. Okay, I just don't hold that view because I don't believe that Scripture demands it, and I think that there's been well-documented differing opinions on that all the way back to Augustine. And so, I think studying the history of that enriches your view of the various ways in which Genesis 1 has been interpreted. There are, for every Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis, there is a, John Walton from Wheaton College. And so there are a diverse opinion about that chapter and about the mode of creation within the body of Christ. And my personal studies have led me to very strongly believe that it does not demand a young birth. And so I think what that does is it emancipates us from that perceived restriction, right? When we're looking at these scientific evidences. And can I imagine or model out how evolution over the course of 5-10 billion years could bring about humans? I mean, I don't think I can map that out for you tonight. But do I think that it is feasible, given what we understand about the process? Absolutely. Because one of the things that you missed in that question is that while you talked about the rate of molecular evolution and how beneficial alleles are rare and that the selection on those beneficial alleles are even rarer, what's being toggled all throughout history is the environment, right? And that has a major influence on whether something is beneficial or not. And while that introduces a monkey wrench and makes it a lot more challenging for us to model because we can't go back in time and see what the various kinds of varying environments were, that's an example of a kind of variable that those models generally don't take into account or don't know how to take into account appropriately. And that could greatly influence the perceived likelihood of something like that.
You kind of just started answering what I was going to ask, but I want to further it a little bit. You identified yourself as an evolutionary creationist, and I've seen Ken Ham's videos on Answers in Genesis, and he basically claims that it's illogical to believe in both, that it doesn't work, you can't accept the Bible and evolution, and his foundation for that is in a 100% literal view of the Bible. So what I want to know is, if you take the Bible word for word, like, is it 100% literal? Do you see it metaphorically? And as an extension to that, do you believe that Christianity is open to any views in science? Like, can you accept anything in science and still be a Christian?
Great questions. What does the word literal mean? I think my answer to that question is actually dependent on how we're going to define that term. And by the way, that's something that I don't think we do often enough in these conversations. People throw out these terms, common descent, evolution, literalism, and different people actually have different views of what that means. Okay, so yeah, were you want to?
What I meant by that is just that some people will take, say, periods of time in the Bible variably. It's not absolutely as it's defined. A day doesn't necessarily mean a day. It could mean a long period of time, and so...
Right. So in that sense, I don't honestly believe that there is a single person who takes the Bible literally. And here's what I mean by that. At some point or the other, it says that the sun set. If we want to take that ultra literally, we could suggest that the Bible is so anti-scientific that it really thinks that the sun moves, which is in fact one of the verses that, by the way, the church pointed to in the whole affair with Galileo, which again should warn us as believers to not make Scripture say things that it doesn't intend to say. That's a very cautionary tale for us in this sort of evolution debate. But this whole notion of, I take the Genesis 1 ultra literally and you don't is, I think, a fallacious argument because none of us are really taking various aspects of the Bible ultra literally. We recognize that there are ways of saying things, there are poetic ways of communication, there are historical eyewitness account forms of communication, there are various literary forms. And so we recognize that in other parts of Scripture, and now we laugh about the Galileo account, but it wasn't so funny then. because we were taking that part ultra literally. We don't anymore. And I fear that we may be doing something like that to Genesis 1. So the argument is that we have to read and interpret in exactly the way that it is laid out there. I think what literal means is that we need to do the work to understand what the author and what God intended for us to understand. Because it could be different in different components of the Bible. We shouldn't do that lightly. We shouldn't do it in a way that allows us to accommodate whatever new scientific fad we feel like accommodating. Because that would amount to essentially diluting Scripture and just morphing it to be whatever we wanted it to be. But I do think we need to do the hard work of saying, what does God intend to communicate to us from this part of Scripture? What did the author mean when he said, X, Y, and Z? And I think what we'll find, particularly when you see the array of different scholarly interpretations, is that there's a lot more to that than just saying that because that word is there, I'm going to take it as the way that I interpret that word. I think we need to do a lot more work instead of imposing our sort of interpretation and culture on the text to say, how does it make sense within the context of that culture? How would it have been read in that time? What is it really intending to say to us? That's some of the work that I think we need to do, and where I may differ, and actually where I do differ with Ken Ham.
We're at time right now.
Okay.
If you have a question, Praveen will be in the lobby afterwards. He'd be happy to take that question.
Thank you very much.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.